I'm Anya Kavarkis. I'm the head of jewelry and metalsmithing in the Department of Art, obviously. And I'm pleased to introduce our lecturer tonight, Namita Gupta Wiggers, who is a writer, curator, and educator based in Portland, Oregon. She is the director of the recently launched Master of Arts in Craft Studies at the Warren Wilson College in North Carolina. She is the director and co-founder of the online forum, Critical Craft Forum. And actually, those of you that are craft-based, you can ask for permission on Facebook to join the forum and sort of forever be linked to research opportunities and things that are happening in the field and books that are coming up. Sorry, I pulled that away. So it's a really nice way to stay informed, especially when you're done with school. And I know I have a lot of people in here who are graduating, so you should ask to join. Students, yeah. So do that. It would be great to do. Let's see. And then from 2004, which is when I met you, she was the curator and then director and chief curator at the Museum of Contemporary Craft in Portland, Oregon, which we used to visit a lot when it was still open as a program. Namita regularly contributes to online and in-print journals and books. She writes, she serves on the editorial boards of Garland Magazine and Norwegian Crafts. Recent curatorial projects include Across the Table, Across the Land with Michael Strand from the National Council on Ceramic Education and the Arts. Everything Has Been Materials for Scissors to Shape, a textile-focused exhibition at the Wing Luke Museum of Asian Experience in Seattle. And a forthcoming publication with Wiley Blackwell Publishers, and also a project that she's come and talked to my students about in my class, Gender and Adornment, which is an ongoing research project with Benjamin Lignell. She is the Center for Art Research at the University of Oregon. She's our inaugural writer in residence for 2019 to 2020. 2020. And I'm so grateful to have you here because I just really appreciate the perspective that she has in the field of craft, and I think she'll give you a lot of context today to sort of rethink maybe ways that you think about it. And so I welcome you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Anya. Thank you so much. It's kind of weird when I start to think about having met you in '04, and it feels like a really long time ago. And I did notice, thanks to all of our social media things, that it was literally exactly 2 years ago that Ben and I came and spoke to your class about our gender and jewelry project, and Phoenix Booth was in the class and is now going to be graduating in our first class of graduates from the MA in Critical Craft Studies. So if anyone's interested in the program, Phoenix is here and is happy to talk with you about the program. So first I want to thank both Anya and Brian for the invitation, and we've had an incredible couple of days. Yesterday, day before yesterday, Garth Clark was speaking in Portland, Oregon. Yesterday, we had a conversation about hyperobjects with a number of people, other faculty from the department, and it's just been a really wonderful day of meetings with students. I know that I saw several of the students that I spoke with, and just want to thank you for sharing your work with me. Sharing conversations. It's not easy, and I appreciated having the time to sort of spend the last few days just cogitating and thinking, so thank you for that. I appreciate it. So, 100 lifetimes in a day. This is a quote from the sculptor James Searles. Does anyone know James's work? I don't know how well he's known anymore outside of Texas. He's of a different generation, and than I think some of you may be paying attention to right now. But he said at one time, and it's on the back of a book, that he makes objects, and he wishes that he could be like Merlin and just wave a wand and make everything that he thought of in a single day. And he says, you know, it takes me so long to make anything that I just wish I had a lifetime to make everything I think of in one day. And he wants 100 lifetimes in one day, and I feel like that all the time. I feel like I never have enough time to get everything I want to get done. I never have enough time to talk to all the people who are out there who are interesting. look at all the great exhibitions, go read all the books. There's a lot of books on my stack that I haven't gotten to. I post them on Instagram. Don't count on my having read them all very quickly, but they're on there. And it's just how I feel about my life, and as someone who doesn't make objects, although I did have a jewelry practice for a while. I wasn't very good. There's a reason I don't do it anymore. I was okay, but I've gone in my life from a time where what I was doing was making exhibitions and using the space of an exhibition as a way of thinking through ideas, thinking through craft, thinking through history. And now I think of it more as really consciously making history itself, teaching other people how to make history and theory. And it's interesting how, for me, my research process is actually very much an applied practice. I really appreciated yesterday in the conversation about hyperobjects, all the people who applied it to their practice, because it felt the same way for me too. I can't read theory just for theory's sake. I have to have a place to put it. And running this program gives me a place to put that now in a different sort of way, to think about it in terms of teaching. So my practice and what I do every day has changed a lot since I left the museum in 2014. And it's not so pretty to do research. This is a very cleaned up look for what research looks like. If you saw my house, you would see lots and lots of stacks. There's things all over the wall. Research in craft means that people might hand you a bag of all the stuff that they pulled out of their closet. They might let you go into their drawers and look at all the slides of things that they had taken pictures of during the 60s and 70s. You might be sitting in somebody's house, you might be sitting in a museum, you might be sitting on the street. There's so many different places where craft research happens. And some days I kind of wish it was this neat and tidy, because it just isn't. So I like stories, and one of the things that I want to play around with today is using 3 sort of stories about forests and trees as a way of framing how I'm thinking about research right now. Asking questions about which forest, which trees, which narratives is part of something that I'm doing in the program as well. For me, storytelling is a way that I understood my being a first-generation immigrant and my parents' connections to another place and another time. Some of my favorite memories are my dad sitting at the dinner table when my siblings were younger and they had been taken off to go get a bath, and I got to be there, and he would tell me stories about relatives I'd never met, places I've never been, and it gave me a chance to understand my place in the world in a really, really different way. So for me, storytelling that connects places and times and communities is really, really important. And I think that it ties in with fairy tales, and Lori Talcott is here, and I think Lori will appreciate that I have a real fondness for fairy tales. And if anybody goes to Portland, you should go see Shaking the Tree Theater. My friend Samantha Vandermerva runs it. She's the director, and several years ago, she did a piece called The Tripping Point. And when you walked into the room, there were several stations, if you will, or several small rooms. And in each of those rooms, you got a menu, and you got to pick which space you went to. You could go hear a retelling of Sleeping Beauty by a contemporary playwright. You could go hear Jack and the Beanstalk in a different way. In this version, Jack and the Beanstalk, Jack is getting ready to go to a benefit, and he's putting on his tuxedo because he's getting a prize as a hero. And he's plagued by all the people he didn't save when he went up and he killed the giant, and he can hear, and he's haunted by the voices of the people that were in the oven in the play and unable to escape. So it's a really different twist on fairy tales. But the thing that happened that I want you to think about, not just when I'm talking, but also in the way you take in knowledge, the way you take in stories, the way you take in narratives, is the way that a fairy tale works. And this play experience reinforced that for me. So you might have been in Jack and the Beanstalk, and all of a sudden you'd hear this yelling, roaring sound. And you're like, what in the world is that? And then you might pick a different play. You might go hear Sleeping Beauty. And at the same time, you heard this roaring, growling sound. And then you went to the place where the wolf was. And you got the source of the roaring, growling sound. And then the next time you went to a different space, you knew what it came from. You understood what that story was. And there's this echo of repetition and trace and knowledge that gets built up. This is how fairy tales work. This is how knowledge works. We retell the same stories over and over again. In academia, we tell the same stories over and over again. We try really hard to break that, and that's what my work is really about, is trying to break from telling the same stories the same way over and over again. But there always is this echo and this trace of what you know and what you have learned along the way that you have to kind of work through. So the first tree story comes in North Carolina. And Warren Wilson is located in Swannanoa, North Carolina. Has anybody been to Swannanoa or Asheville? Okay, cool. So beautiful. It's a beautiful place, lots and lots of trees. You stand in one of these spots on the campus, and Dave says, take a look all around, and you see trees on 3 sides. Those trees weren't there 100 years ago. It was all deforested at that time. There weren't the trees and this lush greenery that we know. So it's a different moment to stand there in 2019 and look out and see all of these trees there. And for me, what I've learned from Dave, who is the Dean of Land at Warren Wilson, is that the things that he can look at when he looks at the forest as a crafted environment, he looks at the kinds of ways that the trees that are there are showing themselves from what was done 100 years ago, what was done 50 years ago. And he knows that what he's doing is going to have an impact 50 to 100 years from now. In fact, we've had a conversation about how in 50 years, the trees that our children, that our children's children are going to be able to use are not going to be the same kind of trees that even our generation has had available, because the climate is going to change. The earth is warming, and it's going to alter what kind of materials we actually have available. And just today, Asheville was the first city in the United States to declare that we are in climate crisis. And I'm really proud that there were a number of Warren Wilson students and alums who were involved in the think tank that went with this. And you can see it on the website. So basically, for me, this thinking about these trees is also about how we think we know something. We look at it, we think we understand it, but when you dig a little deeper, you actually find that there's something else going on that's different than what you thought you were looking at. For me, this is a great moment and opportunity to ask questions. How do you find out what is really happening? Who do you need to speak to? Who do you need to talk to? For Dave Ellum, he's talking to forestry people, he's talking to academics, but Dave is the first person to tell you he's going to talk to someone who's lived in the woods and grown up in this area and understands better than he does exactly what changes are going on. Who you speak to understand what you think you know, to understand it differently, is part of doing good research and is really, really critical. So that's the first story. It's also thinking about how we shift our perspectives, how we understand the knowledge that we have that's been constructed. Sorry, y'all. This is one of the dilemmas of progressive lenses. I can't read what's on the screen here. This is how we understand how we shift our perspectives, too, by thinking about the forest. And thinking about how knowledge that we have has been constructed and how we push against things that we know. So the question I have is, how do we understand how to bring all of this into craft discourses? How do we change what we understand craft to be and what craft needs to be going into the next 20, 30, 50, 100 years? All right, the second story is one that I read on Atlas Obscura. This Swedish forest is full of immensely tall and unusually straight oak trees that were planted nearly 200 years ago to build naval ships that never came to be. So what happened is they sent people out, they said, go find us the best place to plant and grow the most fabulous straight trees. And they found this place where there were 3 trees. They cut one of them down, they brought it back, they studied it, they said, yes, this is a perfect tree for shipbuilding. Let's plant a whole forest of them, and then in 100 years, we're gonna have the best Navy ever. Well, 100 years later, people were using steel. They were using other materials. They didn't need the trees. So now there's this exquisite forest of these really perfectly straight trees. So this is about a destination. You know, we think sometimes that our research is about going to pull that information. You know what you want to find, you go plant it, you go pull that out. Sometimes research is about looking for a specific thing, for testing and then tending to that place or that information. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's about understanding that you can't construct the knowledge you think you need to have. You have to be open to see what comes along the way. And things change, things shift, things aren't needed anymore. This is terrifying for a lot of people, the idea that some of the knowledge and some of the core things that we have been taught may not be what we need going into the future. And this is something that I think we have to face. And for me, this story kind of brings that into light. Also, patience. Oh my God, planting trees and waiting 100 years to have the best Navy? That's kind of an amazing idea. Several years ago, the third story is from Bornholm. And several years ago, I had the opportunity to go to Bornholm. It's an island just off of Copenhagen, right in the ocean between Denmark and Sweden. We're driving along, and all of a sudden, the whole light changed. We were driving, and then suddenly it all got very, very dark, very, very close in. The trees were tight. It was like I had this visceral feeling of being in a fairy tale, being in Sleeping Beauty or something like that, where everything was a different feeling. And it turned out that we were driving through one of the oldest forests in that part of the world that is still remaining. And so basically what happens is, for me, this is a story about this tension between darkness and light, what we know, what we don't know, not being afraid to walk into something that you don't know. Let me tell you, adjuncts in academia are always teaching things they don't know. How many here are adjunct professors? How many times have you been asked to teach a class that you don't know? I taught history of graphic design at Portland State University twice. You know, that's not my area. You know, but I know how to teach. I know how to get people excited. I know how to do the research to do the work, right? How you engage what you don't know and what feels uncomfortable is also part of doing research. And also letting things sit, letting things just be and kind of experiencing it as you move through different things. All right, I'm not going to come back to the trees. I know that there were a number of tree books, Overstory and The Secret Life of Trees and all kinds of things. And the mushroom, what's the mushroom book? The mushroom. At the End of the World? Yes, The Mushrooms at the End of the World. I think this is part of what everyone's interested in right now. It's surfacing everywhere. Even with the students today, I had conversations about the environment and mountains and time and space. So I know that this is part of what people are thinking about. So keep these in mind as we go through, and I'll leave it for you to just figure out how you want to pull it back in. All right, I'm going to walk through a couple of projects that I've been doing and the way that research has happened for me in these. And again, I want to be clear, I am testing out this way of sharing research, which is totally different than when I give a talk about my curatorial work, because my curatorial work ends in an exhibition and a book, usually. These are pretty concrete objects, and these are the things we usually will say, here's the thing we made, let me tell you about everything that went into it. I'm trying to just tell you about my process. So some of this is going to work and some of it isn't. So bear with me, and in the Q&A, if we get a chance, tell me what worked and what didn't, and then it'll help me figure out a different way to talk about my own research. So looking for craft in all the wrong archives. I did not bring the audio with the song, Looking for Love in All the Wrong Places, but that was what was going through my head with this title. So what happened is, a couple years ago, John Brody and Blair Saxon Hill had a collection of books from Max and Hattie Mae Nixon, who taught here at University of Oregon for decades. And they basically got their estate, all the books from these two professors who had taught in the art department, had taught in home economics, had really been a major part of this institution. And I got super excited. I was like, I just want to see the books. I just want to see what they had. So they had already sold a number of the art books, but John said, I have 8 boxes. So I literally went over and I spent a day photographing all the books that he still had in these boxes. I didn't bring my pictures because I'm going to just tell you, I used them for a talk at School of the Art Institute of Chicago. I think it's online. If you're interested, I can get you a link to it. They're the crappiest pictures because I'm literally standing at this table and just shooting it with my iPhone. You know, they're really, really not great pictures. But what happened is I was able to take this box of books and I had to figure out, what do I do with this information? What is here? So I started organizing it chronologically. And what you start to see is the shift in the 1930s from WPA projects, workbooks that are teaching women how to build looms for themselves, engineering the loom, constructing it, learning how to use it, building enterprises for themselves. You go into the 1940s and 50s and you start to get better living through chemicals, where Dow Chemicals is teaching people about Dacron and Herculon, and you start to see this move from textiles, from domestic work and production into this space where it's connected to science and technology. And you start to see in the 60s women removing themselves from home economics, part of the second wave feminist movement, and textiles starts moving into art departments and out of home ec. And it starts moving away from engineering. And it made me realize that women gave up a lot when they removed themselves from this narrative too. And now this is part of like the tech industry, also another big connection. Nike and Adidas and all of those places also big and connected to University of Oregon too. It's a fascinating mixture of books and a fascinating way to take something that seems like nothing and actually turn it into a narrative to be able to sort it and figure out how it actually tells a story about shifts in craft discourse over the decades. Another project I've done with Aram Hansa-Fuentes and Lisa Weinbaum is Unsettling Coloniality. You can request this from me. It's a PDF, and it ties in philosophically with some of the things that Stephanie Sahuko, some of you may know her work. Stephanie is very much about public pedagogy, and she has a website, for example, where you can post syllabi and materials, because here's the thing, I can give you this list of books, right? It's categorized. There's ways in which we have structured it under settler colonialism or colonialism and neo-colonialism. There are other categories like whiteness and white privilege. We can give you this list of books. You have to figure out what to do with it, right? That's that, but this is about taking research, taking our research and sharing it and making it available in a way that it becomes a tool for other people, but also a tool that puts the agency of how you're going to use it and what you're going to do with this information back into your hands. And frankly, off the shoulders of me and Aram and Lisa. So this is available if anybody would like to get a copy of it. If you go to the Critical Craft Forum website or email me at criticalcraftforum@gmail.com. Ooh, that took me a minute. I have like 4 emails to keep track of. You can email me and I'd be happy to get you a copy of it. So one of the projects, and I wasn't going to talk about this, but this came up in some of the studio visits, some of the questions, and it came up yesterday in our conversation about hyperobjects. And so I thought I'd mention that there's an exhibition called Raw, Craft, Commodity, and Capitalism that I submitted an essay for. And my essay is called Matter and Material, Matter as Material. And one of the things that I did with this essay is I used Linda Tuhiwai-Smith and Catherine Yusof and Sven Beckert. Linda Tuhiwai-Smith wrote Decolonizing Methodologies. Catherine Yusof wrote A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None. And Sven Beckert wrote Empire of Cotton. How many of you have read some of these books? Some of them seem familiar? Okay. Empire of Cotton is a publication that actually, we start the residency by having our students read that during the summer before they come, so they can start thinking about the way that craft materials are part of empire, are part of imperialism, are part of capitalism, so that it shifts your understanding of the object isn't just that I made this and I'm going to sell it, but understanding the systems in which that circulates and how it connects with bigger questions about politics and power and economics and things like that. What I talk about in this essay, and I'm not going to have time to read it, so I have it here if we have time later and somebody wants to see a copy of it or wants me to read a section from it, I'm happy to do that. She says, having worked very, very hard and cried in the middle because it was really hard. It wasn't going well. So those of you who cry when you're writing, how many of you cry when you're writing? Oh, come on. You know more of you cry when you write. I cry every time. And if someone tells you they don't cry, then they didn't put enough into it. It is so freaking hard to write. And it's so hard to take lots of ideas and put them into something that you think somebody else can actually understand. This one was a hard one to write, and I shared it with Anya and Brian. I think that's all the people looking around the room. I think I shared it just with the two of you before I sent it in. What I'm talking about in this is really emphasizing that geology is not neutral. And in craft, we have this very romantic notion about using natural materials. You use natural clay, you use natural dyes, use natural this, natural that. And we complain that people don't know how things were made. But we don't take that conversation over here where we understand where the materials came from. Every single thing that we use through craft, no matter what kind of craft discipline you are in, has been extracted from the earth or cultivated on the surface of the earth. There isn't anything that isn't impacting the earth in some way. So if we are in climate crisis, we need to understand what that means for the next phase of conversations in craft and in terms of materiality. It can't just be about the materiality of the finished object. It has to be about where the materials came from so we understand what we're doing in this process. I think I'm not going to go into more about that essay, but if we have time, I want to try and make sure we have enough time for Q&A. So one of the books that influenced me on this too is Ocean Vuong's Everything Has on Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. He just won a MacArthur for this book, and there's a way in which he talks about living in the world and being a part of these systems that are bigger than yourself that I thought was really powerful. And has anybody read this book? What did you think about it?
I think it's incredibly moving, and that was my primary.
I think it was one of the most beautifully written books, honestly, that I've read in a really long time. He's a poet, and I was sobbing by page 4. So when you pick it up, be prepared. I really don't cry as much as I'm making it sound like I do, but you know, this is an emotional time. These are emotional days that we're all living in, and maybe things are a little more on the surface, but this particular book I think is absolutely exquisite. Another project, which I literally talked about here 2 years ago to a day, is this ongoing project, Gender and Jewelry Project with Benjamin Lignell. So one of the things that we are trying to do with this project is to move away from, actually I'll stand, take her for a minute. We're trying to move away from doing research that then moves to making this strong, conclusive statement that this is what gender and jewelry is about. We don't want that. We actually want to keep the diversity, keep the specificity of the individual stories from the people that we are interviewing. And we went into this with spending a considerable amount of time developing a protocol, research protocol, an interview protocol that focuses on our being very, very aware about our subjectivities as cisgendered female and male, European male, immigrant to the United States, or first generation. My parents were the ones who immigrated. And understanding where we're coming from in these conversations that we're having with everybody. And we've had conversations with some of the most amazing people. Edexa Stern, who does tattooing in San Francisco, Tigger Ferguson, who is the founder of Boylesque, drag queens, jewelry artists, gallerists, all people with all different kinds of connections to the questions of gender and adornment. And what we've done is we did our interviews, we've shared the texts with our interviewees with additional questions. They've responded and asked us more questions, which we've documented, and then we go back and forth until we get to a place where everybody feels like all the things that we needed to discuss have been addressed. We're hoping to get the first couple of them published in the next few months. This project is a great example of how research is sometimes really, really long. I think we started this project about 2015, maybe 14 was when the grant went in, and we haven't been able to get it to publication yet. We've done a lot of talks on it. We're in Sweden in March as guests of Jaspis there talking about it. Sometimes these projects take a long time to reach the place where they're going to have that endpoint. And sometimes projects, when you start research projects, so I did an exhibition on embroidery and women and a few men who were embroidering on vintage textiles, and to this day people still send me images of vintage textiles that have been embroidered on. So you do these projects and research doesn't just stop. It percolates, it comes back again and again. So I want to talk about my biggest monster in a box. Spalding Gray has this great performance. If you haven't seen it, this is one you should take a look at. And it's a book called Forms in Japan. So around 2008, I'm sitting in a meeting with Shannon Stratton and Judith Lehman while we were putting together Gestures of Resistance. And I said, did you notice that everybody's using Richard Serra's verb list again and again and again? It's coming in design classes, it's coming in art classes, it's connected to this new interest in materiality. What's going on? And Judith says, well, I don't know the list. Let me look it up and I'll give you a call. So just to give you a grounding, this is probably, I think, 1966. Don't quote me on that. I forgot to put the date up. To roll, to crease, to fold, to store, to bend, right? Actions, action verbs to act on material. This is about bringing the action painting, action of expressionism into performance and sculpture and other ways of working on materials, right? In 1957, this book came out, and it's called Forms in Japan. Forms in Japan. It was translated into English by Kenneth Yasuda, who is the person who translated the first book on haiku, and I believe was at Berkeley at one point around the time that Richard Serra and a number of the folks from that generation were in that area as well. And one of my students in the Applied Craft Design program got very interested in this when I explained to him that this list, I just needed to understand what was going on with this list. Well, it turns out that this list is pretty much Richard Serra's verb list. If you look over here, it's structured in forms to do certain things, forms of unity, forms of force, etc., right? But take a look down at the bottom, and I can't see it on my screen, so I'm going to come over here. And if you look over here, I'm trying to find where it is now, but to tie, to bind, to weave, to join, to brace, right? Taking a look at those words. When you compare the list to Richard Serra's list, Don maps this out. And what ends up happening is, with the forms in Japan, the words that were down at the bottom become the top words in Richard Serra's list. And it's verbatim. It's verbatim, this list from Forms in Japan. What does it mean that American minimalism and conceptualism is based on a Japanese book that has been uncited that focuses on craft? I stay up wondering, and I still haven't figured out what the hell to do with this information. I talk to people about it. I share it with people. Everyone says, oh, yeah, God, that's really interesting. And there's an article by David Campany who writes about how Ed Ruscha's all the buildings on the Sunset Strip, I don't know if anybody's familiar with that. It's like 20 feet long. Center is vacant, and it's a photograph of every building on the strip, right? If you go visit this website, you will see that that came after a Japanese photography project that had exactly the same thing. What do we do with this information? I don't know. I don't know what to do with it. So if anybody wants to work on this with me, come see me, because this keeps me up at night. It has nothing to do with teaching my program. It has nothing to do with the Companion on Contemporary Craft, and it has nothing to do with the 3 other essays that I have to finish writing. But I'm obsessed with figuring out what the heck this means and how do we talk about it, because this is really important to understand. It also ties in with what I was saying before about research kind of coming and percolating. It ties into this exhibition that I was lucky enough to do the education for, called Transparent Thread, Asian Philosophy and Recent American Art, and it was curated by Gail Gelbert and Jerry DePauli. And basically what happened was they went in and they were noticing that Baldessari and Eric Orr and William Wiley and this whole generation of artists who were of the beat sort of generation, a lot of them West Coast, they all had a certain set of books on their shelves. Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, The Tao of Tea, Alan Watts. I don't know if any of you know Alan Watts, but he was a big radio guy, all about Americanized Zen. So they noticed this, and they started looking at the artwork produced by these guys and realized that there was this uncited connection between what they were looking at, what they were thinking about, and this very Americanized kind of Zen ideas that were coming through these books. So this was in 1992 that this happened. But before that, when I was an undergrad, I wrote a paper that got me into graduate school about connections between Marcel Duchamp and Dada and the Tao of Tea, so Yatsuya Yanagi's book on tea. It's a problematic paper. I won't share it with any of you. But it got me into grad school. But I'm mentioning it because these ideas, these things that you work on throughout your time in your life, they percolate back up again and again. So I probably can't let go of the other one because I can't let go of this. So we are at quarter till, and we are ending at 5. Is that correct? Yeah? Okay. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time because we're going to be talking a lot about Linda Tuhiwai-Smith tomorrow with decolonizing methodologies. But I would highly recommend that if you don't know this book, that you write it down and you take the time to read it. You can get a PDF online of the first edition. It is an amazing way to understand how to rethink your research, because the truth of the matter is, most indigenous peoples and their communities, says Tuhiwai-Smith, do not differentiate scientific or proper research from the forms of amateur collecting, journalistic approaches, filmmaking, or other ways of taking indigenous knowledge that have occurred so casually over the centuries. Her very first sentence in the book says research is a problematic and really, really problematic word for indigenous communities. Because research, as it's been structured through the Enlightenment, through the academic systems that we've all been educated in, has had a way of categorizing people as the core or the center and the other. It's prioritized certain kinds of knowledge, certain kinds of information over other kinds of information. It's part of the problem with craft discourse right now too, and I say this as someone who is trained as a contemporary art historian. We go to books, we go to MoMA, we go to the places where research, we have been trained that research happens. Craft history is not in MoMA. Craft history is in the church down the street. It's at your family table. It's in the park when there's a fair. That's where craft histories are taking place. It's in non-commodity oriented rituals of carrying a big giant Ganesh through the streets in India. That's where craft histories are. Studio craft history is one thing. It's only one part of a bigger question. So this book has really been influential for me in helping me rethink how I do my research, what questions I ask, who I need to be talking to, how I can make sense of the fact that when an artist hands me a paper bag with like all this stuff in it, that it is part of the research. It is something that I need to value, and I've written books. There's a book on Ken Shores, for example, where a lot of that ephemera that he handed me in that bag is part of the book. Because that is the trace that helps you understand who a person is and the part of craft that connects beyond the object that has been made. So I'm going to move through super fast for just a second, and I'm going to tell you that this is very, very personal for me. I'm an American. When you say American, or when you say American, I don't know if I come to mind. I am born and raised here. I walk like an American, I cuss like an American. When I'm abroad, there is no question that I am not American, okay? But in this country, I get asked, where are you from? My family's history is from over there. It's not part of what we say when we say Americans and American history. So these are the books that influenced my thinking when I was in graduate school. Some of them are books that you may know. Graduate school basically taught me that I was a bad art historian. I asked the wrong questions. When did photography get developed in non-Western European and American places? What is it doing? And I was asking this question. I was told there was no information on that. I found a book in Bengali that was written about, in 1920, about the beginning of photography. My father sat and translated it for me over the whole Thanksgiving. My professor told me it wasn't a legitimate translation because it wasn't done by an academic scholar. So these are the things that my age group has dealt with. You have different problems. But these are the problems that make us angry, make us do the work that we're doing right now and find other ways to change the system from within. My dissertation was about the American family home, and it led me to craft. And the last thing I want to touch on is I am building a program where I am trying to, why is it doing that? I'm not even touching it. I am building a program that is the first program focused on craft history and theory. And I base my philosophy there on a couple of key ideas. Yes, and this comes from improv, where you're building on things. Making space. Make space for other people, make space for other stories, make space to understand that your students are not coming in as empty vessels. They actually have knowledge and experiences that are not yours that you need to hear and listen to and bring into the conversation. Asking questions. What questions lead to questions that you can use to understand research? My computer is possessed. And thinking about which craft do you want to talk about? You can come in and we can talk about ceramics, we can talk about textiles, but which kind of craft? Do you want to talk about studio craft, or do you want to talk about pottery that is sold in a tourist environment? We can help you understand which craft. So a lot of my research now is thinking about how do I get people who are coming in with certain knowledge through certain kinds of information to be able to ask these questions in their own research and work down the road. How do I move them away from thinking William Morris is the beginning of craft? Because he's not the beginning of craft. William Morris is part of a larger narrative. He's beginning perhaps of studio craft, or arts and crafts movement leads to studio craft, I should say. But he's not the beginning. Here he is in front of a textile that he stole from India. My feeling is it's time for us to actually let William Morris be part of the story, not be on top of the story. And I put this in here because it has pissed people off every single time I've shared this. And I love that, because that means that there is something we need to address about how we understand craft, how we understand craft history, and what is at stake if we rewrite the narrative and shift the power structure to tell this story instead of this story as the beginning point. I'm going to stop here, because the rest of, I'll just let them play through because my computer wants to. These are basically images of the program and the kind of research that we're doing to understand how to teach craft, and it's a lot of focusing on bringing indigeneity into the program through the beginning, bringing making into the program, workshopping through interviews, research methods where interviewing is a primary research method people have to learn and use, thinking about the meal and the table as part of craft history. How much conversation do you have at a table when, I mean, God, I love having potters at my house because potters bring the best dishes. I like to shop with metalsmiths, though. I'm like you, Vencio. You know, how do we understand how to tell a different story of craft that isn't using the same information, or is using the same information and telling it and analyzing it in a different sort of way? So those are the things that I'm researching now and thinking about and moving forward with. So thank you. Do we have time for a question or two?
We have time for some questions, but you have to wait for the microphone to come to you if you have questions. So if the microphone is here, it'll pass over away.
Don't be shy. There's one back there.
I think my first question that I would love to hear your answer to is, how can someone, especially at the very beginning of their art career, attempt to kind of ground themselves in their practice enough, like fully aware of the vast amount of knowledge that, like, especially like, one of the first things you mentioned early on was the best way to research is to seek people that know fully what you think that you already know. So I guess even beginning to develop a body of work, beginning to ground yourself in that practice at the beginning of the research process as well.
It's a good question. You're here in this environment partly because you want to learn something new, right? And art is about, working through art practice is about testing and trying and experimenting and asking questions. And I think one of the advantages of researching as an artist is you get to do it through materials, and you get to do it through texts and art history and other disciplines too, and figure out what is going to work to get your idea out there. There's no way any of us knows everything. And at some point you just have to understand what your process is and who you're asking, and figure out and get the right people around you who are going to help you examine whether you've gone deeply enough, as much as you can or cannot do. We have, there are places well, there's a student of ours who lives in Lander, Wyoming. Her nearest university is what, like 3 hours away? Something like that, 3 hours away driving. For her to get books means it's a very different process. So she has to figure out how to do her research in a different sort of way. You are here, so you're going to get certain kinds of knowledge, you're going to get certain kinds of information, but you're also going to have this amazing resource of what is it, an R1 institution, isn't it? So you've got like one of the biggest research models here. Go to the other departments, go listen to lectures in other departments and figure out who you can start to. You have to take agency. You have to have the agency to go ask those questions. And your classes, they're teaching you how to start doing that. But if you're going to really make an art practice something that is a lifetime of work, you have to go out and do that. You have to just keep trying and go out and do that on your own. I don't know if I'm really answering your question. Am I getting to what you were wondering about? Sort of. It's not easy, and I feel like there's always a place where you have to stop what you're doing and put something out there. And what we're going to talk about tomorrow in Anya's seminar is we're going to look very closely at Linda Tuhiwai-Smith's introduction in the first chapter. And I'm actually sharing an essay that I wrote about Sonia Clark about 10, 11 years ago. And I look at it now, and there are things about it that I would write so very differently now that I've been thinking through this concept of decolonizing methodologies. And there are things that I wrote in there that I recognize were so problematic. So I think there's something about being able to revisit and understand that it's okay to go back and look back with criticality and say, you know what, I think I might do this a little differently now, and take that into your next work, I think is a real power and strength, and there's a humility in that. One more?
I'd love to actually hear you elaborate on what that is. I know we're going to talk about it tomorrow, but not the whole audience won't be there tomorrow. It's a small group. But
On the essay?
In the essay, like what
was bothering me?
What are the revisions that you feel like you have a different?
Oh my God, who's going to be in this seminar tomorrow? I can't, Anya.
You can't?
I can't.
All right.
I can't. It's going to like totally give it away. I can't. I'll just say that there's a way, when you if you read this essay, there's a way in which it's short, and I wrote it at a moment when there was this like huge rise of interest in craft. It was like early in my writing critically about craft, shifting from contemporary art, and there's things that I do in there that are not paying attention to what I'm using to provide the evidence to support Sonia's work. I can't be more specific. I'm sorry. Okay, so everyone who's coming to the seminar, raise your hands, and everyone who wants to know what I'm like annoyed with about my essay, those are the people to ask. There was did somebody raise a hand over there? There's someone over there. I'm sorry.
Hi, I'd love to hear you talk about climate change or climate crisis, as you mentioned before, and maybe like touch on some of the cognitive dissonance that crafters might have using negative, or like carbon negative or carbon neutral, you know, like that might be like the idea, but sometimes it's not that way.
Sure.
I sometimes feel like a cognitive dissonance as like a craft maker, like a designer, so what's our responsibility as designers to be, you know, relevant in a climate crisis?
It's a great question. It's also a huge question. And I'm not sure that I feel comfortable making that decision for each individual. So if you don't mind, I'm going to answer it by saying what I talk about in my essay, if that's okay, as a way to kind of enter that. One of the things that happens with the way the Anthropocene is being talked about right now is, and this is something Catherine Yusoff points out in her book, A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None, is that it tends to be located in the steam engine, Watt's steam engine, and the bomb, the nuclear bomb. And there's a way in which these stories tend to locate the action and the catalyst for the Anthropocene in certain kinds of projects of modernity and technology. And they don't pay attention to the things that led to those places being in the power that they are in, which is, in Catherine Yusoff's terms, in 1441, when the first black bodies from Africa were sold into slavery in Lisbon and in Portugal and Spain, because there was this new world here. And there was a need to get the gold because of genocide and illness and viruses, but all these different things that decimated the population that was living there, so they needed bodies in order to make that happen. And those bodies get moved to Europe, then they get taken and treated as inhuman bodies. They're treated as objects, and then they're doing the work of extracting the gold. But then it gets even more complicated because it gets tied in with the cotton and the empire, because or the empire of cotton argument and the way that he maps it out as war capitalism, because the first time that people sailed this way from Europe was the time when they were working against natural movements of the wind. I mean, they called them the trade winds for a reason. It was because those winds were what took you over here, and then you waited, and then you came back with the winds. And at that time, places like India controlled the cotton because they were fabricating it, they were growing it, they were making it. It was the commodity people wanted, and that commodity becomes what other people want to control, and then it becomes the commodity that's used to purchase human beings to then go over to the United States and the Americas and grow other kinds of cotton that fit the steam engine and the way that the steam engine and technology works. So these are kind of some of the things that I touch on in this essay. But I feel like, I think that it is our responsibility, and this is outside of an academic setting perhaps, but when we walk into a place and they say, this is a local piece, this was made by a local potter, and you're buying local. Okay, you're buying a bowl that was made locally, yes. But the clay is not local. There's not clay deposits that produce the same kind of clay that a lot of times you'll see in Oregon and Washington. In fact, when I was at the Archie Bray, they were saying that the Archie Bray produces a certain kind of clay. They're mining a certain kind of clay there, but most of the clay comes from back east, east of the Mississippi. So that local potter, it may be a local individual, but they're buying materials that are sourced from someplace else. And it's just, I think we have to find a new narrative to talk about what we're actually using and where those materials are coming from, and step away from this sort of romanticized, idealized thing of the studio craftsperson who works on their own and makes something by hand from the materials to finish, and because it's just not the way it's happening. I don't know if I think it's a problem. I think it's a real problem, and I think it's something that we definitely need to do more work on in the next several decades. Anybody else? Anybody? Yeah, one more over there.
Hi, Hi, thanks so much. I have so many questions, but I'm going to try and keep it down to one. As far as the use of materials, what are your thoughts about using salvage materials or sort of trash, especially with the complications of the neoliberal idea of commodification of waste?
That's a huge one. I mean, and it's funny because I came into curating in '04 where there were all these shows that were going on about like recycled materials, and they were making objects, and it was all about selling those objects in an art context. And it was, we're recording this, right? Oh, can I speak bluntly? Do I have to bleep things out? A lot of it was just shit. I mean, seriously, like these pieces didn't need to be made. And I understand like the need to make, I get it, I do it too. But like some of it was just, there was no point in it, and it was just replicating that same commodity structure. I totally agree. I think Cradle to Cradle and that show that Bruce Mao did about massive changes started getting some good conversations. And I know Cradle to Cradle is really problematic, and later people were like, hey, you know what, he's not really doing what he said he was doing. But there was something about that moment that opened up a different kind of conversation. And I think in more recent years, I'm seeing more companies that are thinking through the chain of making a little differently than they had been 10, 15 years ago. Even Nike and Adidas and places like that are thinking about this differently. The thing that I think isn't changing is the scale of consumption. And I think it's the scale of consumption that is causing all of this debris and leftover waste that we don't know what to do with. So H&M takes your clothes and, you know, burns them, and I don't know what they do with them. Shreds them and uses them for insulation and whatnot. And there are countries where you can't deposit waste anymore because it's so toxic. The fashion industry is horrendously toxic. But until we address that consumption problem, I think we're not going to get away from the commodification of recycling and reuse. I think it's part of capitalism, and I don't know if we can get away from it until, God, this is cynical, until there's like total collapse and we go back to barter systems. I just don't know how that's going to work. I don't know. That's going to make people call me later and go, what? But I think it's tied in with these capitalistic structures that we've all grown up with, our parents grew up with, our grandparents grew up with. It's like, how do you get away from it? Thank you all very much. Thanks for the questions.